Sophie Blake was never the center of attention. At 34, she worked the night shift at a logistics warehouse in Denver, where her presence went unnoticed by almost everyone around her. The air smelled of cardboard and diesel fuel, and the only sounds that filled the space were the hum of forklifts and the soft shuffle of boots against concrete. The towering shelves stacked with inventory seemed endless, a perfect metaphor for the quiet life Sophie had chosen. She liked it that way. Being invisible was her comfort zone. It allowed her to work in peace, her eyes fixed on her clipboard as she methodically cataloged parts that would never see the light of day. But Sophie wasn't just any warehouse worker. 6 years ago, she had been an Army aviation mechanic, responsible for maintaining some of the most advanced military helicopters in the world. She had logged over 400 hours of unauthorized flight time on AH-64 Apache helicopters, all in the name of perfecting her craft. But that life had been taken from her. A bureaucratic reshuffling during her last year in the service had left her classified as non-essential. She was quietly discharged, her name and her work erased from the records. The rotor stabilization protocol she had developed, a protocol that could have revolutionized military flight, was buried in classified files with no recognition of her involvement. Sophie had tried to forget about it. She had tried to move on, but that all changed when the letter arrived. The envelope was simple, folded neatly, with no return address. Inside was a letter from the Pine Ridge Flight Academy. It was a probationary acceptance. The letter was brief, just a few lines. Probationary admission approved. Report Monday at 0800. It was the opportunity she had longed for but never dared to hope for. The academy was one of the most prestigious in the country, known for producing top-tier military pilots. And Sophie had earned her place, though her path had been anything but conventional. The academy's acceptance letter came as a shock, but Sophie didn't hesitate. She packed her small apartment, overlooking the airfield at Peterson Air Force Base, with only the essentials. The rest of her belongings stayed behind, packed away in cardboard boxes. Most mornings, she would sit in her kitchen, sipping coffee from a dented mug as she watched helicopters slice through the Colorado sky. Their rotors cast shadows that danced on her kitchen wall, and Sophie never closed the blinds. The night before her first day at the academy, she sat at her folding table in her apartment, her worn flight manual open in front of her. She had built a custom flight simulator from salvaged military hardware, and as her fingers danced across the controls, she adjusted for a rotor drift issue she had discovered years ago. It had never been officially acknowledged, but it was a flaw that still existed in the Apache software. Sophie had identified it during her time in Arizona, and she had never forgotten it. The Flight Academy was housed in a gleaming facility, modern and polished with floor-to-ceiling windows. It was everything Sophie's makeshift simulator wasn't. The lobby was filled with photos of successful graduates, mostly young men with confident smiles and crisp uniforms. Sophie didn't fit in here. She arrived early on the first day, wearing a second-hand helmet and her grandfather's faded army jacket. The rescue patch on her sleeve was barely holding on, the threads worn thin from years of washing. Her grandfather had flown combat evacuations during the Vietnam War, and he had passed the patch to her with a simple message: keep it close. You'll know when. Sophie had never fully understood the meaning of the message, but as she stood there, staring at the academy's towering structure, she felt a sense of purpose. The other cadets began to trickle in, wearing expensive flight suits and carrying equipment that still had price tags attached. They were college graduates with engineering degrees and family connections in the aerospace industry. Sophie took a seat in the back row, her patched-up manual in hand, and waited. She didn't belong with them, and they made sure she knew it. That's when Colonel James Harrison walked in. Tall, silver-haired, and covered in military decorations, he commanded attention the moment he entered the room. His eyes scanned the room, his gaze sharp and calculating. He had an aura of authority that Sophie had grown accustomed to during her time in the military. But this time, it was different. His eyes lingered on her longer than the others, and Sophie could feel the weight of his judgment. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice boomed, carrying the authority of someone who had seen it all. Welcome to an elite program. Not all of you belong here, and not all of you will finish. His gaze shifted to Sophie, and for a moment, she could feel his eyes piercing through her worn jacket and patch manual. His words felt personal. Flight training isn't about equality. It's about excellence. Some of you were born to fly. Others, his eyes locked with Sophie's. Others were born to support those who fly. Sophie's heart raced. She knew exactly what he meant, but she wasn't about to let him define her. The first practical session at the academy took place in the simulator bay. Sophie stepped into her assigned cockpit, feeling the weight of every eye on her. 12 state-of-the-art Apache simulators were lined up in perfect rows, each one a piece of cutting-edge technology that made her homemade simulator look like a child's toy. The cadets took their stations, each given a basic systems check to complete. Sophie's hands shook slightly as she settled into the seat, but she quickly steadied herself. The simulator flickered to life, and Sophie began the task. It was a routine exercise, a simple check of the Apache systems. Yet, as soon as she began, something fell off. The rotor response settings were wrong. The system had been calibrated to create artificial stability, making the helicopter feel unnaturally smooth. Sophie knew it was a flaw, the same flaw she had encountered during her unauthorized test flights in Arizona. It was a dangerous calibration error, one that could lead to fatal consequences if left uncorrected. But it was just a simulation. Sophie pressed on, compensating mentally for the discrepancies. Her muscle memory guided her through each sequence, and despite the faulty settings, she completed the exercise with flawless precision. When the session ended, the results flashed on the main display. 98% accuracy. Fastest completion time. 0 system alerts. Her eyes flickered to the side, where Colonel Harrison was reviewing the scores. He looked at the display with a hint of skepticism, his silver eyebrows furrowing. "Run it again, Cadet Blake," he ordered. "There must be a calibration error." Sophie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She repeated the exercise, her hands moving faster this time, her mind calculating each adjustment to compensate for the flawed system. When the results came back, her score had improved to 99%. "Equipment malfunction," Harrison announced to the room, his voice cold. "Cadet Blake, report to maintenance. Your simulator will be recalibrated." Sophie's stomach churned as she gathered her materials. As she turned to leave, she heard whispers behind her. "Did you see her scores? She made it look easy. Where did she learn to fly like that?" Sophie's hands tightened around her folder, but she didn't look back. She had been in this position before, being underestimated, being written off as someone who didn't belong. But she knew better than to let their judgments shape her. She had spent years in the shadows, unnoticed, but she was done being invisible. As Sophie stepped into the hallway, she caught Cadet Brandon Hoffman's voice, his words sharp. "What happens when someone gets into the program through alternative channels? Do they have to meet the same standards as regular applicants?" The room fell silent, waiting for Harrison's response. "Standards are standards," Harrison said, his voice unwavering. "No exceptions. If someone can't meet them naturally, they'll be discovered and removed." He glanced at Sophie again, his eyes lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Sophie could feel the weight of his gaze, the implications of his words sinking in. It was a challenge, and she would rise to it no matter the cost. That night, Sophie sat in her small apartment, looking out at the airfield where helicopters soared in the distance. She felt a rush of determination building inside her, something deeper than just the need to prove herself. She had been in this battle before, fighting for recognition, fighting for a place where she belonged. But now, it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, every person who had ever been told they didn't fit the mold. Sophie wasn't just fighting for a seat at the table. She was fighting to change the table itself. The next day, the academy put the cadets through another round of practical training. Sophie knew it wouldn't be easy. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of everyone's eyes on her. She could feel the quiet hostility from some of the cadets, the whispered judgments from others. But none of that mattered. Not anymore. She had come too far to turn back. When the simulation began, She noticed immediately that the rotor drift issue she had recognized earlier hadn't been fixed. The machine was still calibrated wrong. Sophie's eyes narrowed. She had no intention of letting this go. She completed the exercise with precision again, the same flawless execution as before. But this time, when the scores flashed on the screen, Sophie did not look at the numbers. She looked at Harrison. "Colonel," she said, her voice steady but firm. "The rotor drift issue hasn't been fixed. It's a safety concern." The room went silent. Harrison looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Cadet Blake, this is not the time for your opinions," he snapped. "Just complete the exercise." Sophie took a deep breath, but she didn't back down. "With all due respect, Colonel, I've logged hundreds of hours working on this system. The issue needs to be addressed before it becomes a problem in real flight." There was a moment of stillness. Then Harrison's cold gaze met hers. "We'll address it when we're ready, Cadet. In the meantime, you'll focus on your own performance." But Sophie knew what she had to do. The others might not have seen it, but she knew the risks. If they didn't listen now, the consequences could be fatal when it really counted. The following weeks at the academy were a battle. Every time Sophie entered the simulator bay, it felt like a gauntlet she had to run. The cadets, once polite but distant, began to treat her as an outsider, a problem to be ignored. Cadet Blake wasn't just a name to them. She was the exception to the rule, the anomaly that threatened the comfortable structure they had built for themselves. Every test, every exercise seemed like an uphill struggle, but Sophie wasn't one to back down. The equipment continued to malfunction at suspiciously perfect moments, all centered around her. Her simulator was always the one with the sticky controls, the flickering displays, the audio glitches that made it almost impossible to follow the instructions. It wasn't just coincidence. It was sabotage. Yet, every time Sophie reported the issues, the maintenance team would find nothing wrong. And when another cadet used the same equipment, it mysteriously worked perfectly. Sophie kept her head down, focusing on the one thing that mattered, getting better, proving herself. She wasn't going to let them break her. But it wasn't just the equipment. During group exercises, Sophie was always paired with the weakest performers. She was given solo rotations, while the others worked in teams. She could feel their eyes on her, the whispers that followed her everywhere. Affirmative action case. Diversity hire. She won't last another week. These words were like poison, seeping into her every moment. When she sat down for meals, conversations would stop. When she stood up, they would resume, punctuated with snide comments about her presence. "She doesn't belong here." Brandon Hoffman, the golden child of the academy, seemed to take particular pleasure in Sophie's misery. He was everything Sophie wasn't: young, privileged, connected, and utterly confident in his place. The whispers grew louder when he spoke. What happens when someone gets in through alternative channels? Do they have to meet the same standards as everyone else? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sophie felt her pulse quicken. The words were aimed directly at her. She had been labeled. She wasn't like the others, and they wanted to remind her of that at every turn. But Sophie remained focused. She was determined to prove them wrong. One day, during a particularly brutal flight theory class, Sophie was assigned an outdated flight computer with a known GPS lag. The others received the new, advanced equipment. It was a handicap, but Sophie didn't flinch. She completed the course with precision, using dead reckoning and visual landmarks to compensate for the faulty navigation system. She finished the course in record time, despite the setbacks. When the results were posted, Sophie's name was at the top of the list once again. It was no surprise to her. She had trained for this. She had been preparing for these moments long before she even stepped foot on the academy grounds. But it was different this time. This time, Mitchell didn't even pretend to investigate. "Cadet Blake," Colonel Harrison announced coldly, "your scores will be marked as unverified, pending equipment review. These results will not be added to the official rankings." Sophie felt her chest tighten. She had done everything right. Her performance had been flawless. But it didn't matter. They were trying to erase her again. She walked back to her locker, her hands clenched into fists. She caught a glimpse of her nameplate, Blake Estet, a constant reminder of how little she belonged here. As she passed the cadets, she overheard them whispering, "She thinks she's better than us. She won't last long." Sophie closed her locker with a soft click, but before she could leave, she noticed something. Her flight suit, the one she had worn for every session, was hanging in her locker. But it wasn't the same. It had been slashed, cut across the chest with surgical precision. The fabric was ruined, and Sophie could feel the sting of the attack. They had done this on purpose to send a message. Pinned to the fabric was a handwritten note. "Maybe now you'll get the hint." The words hit her like a slap in the face. But Sophie didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She carefully folded the ruined suit and placed it in her bag. The note was a reminder of what she had already known. Nothing would come easy here. She had to fight for every inch. But she wasn't afraid of a fight. That night, back in her apartment, Sophie pulled out a box she hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside were all the documents from her Army service, her real flight records, and the protocol she had developed for the Apache rotor stabilization issue that had been buried without recognition. The letter from her grandfather's rescue patch was tucked in a box. The words, "Keep it close. You'll know," when still fresh in her memory. She spread the papers out across the table, carefully studying the files. The weight of what she had accomplished, what she had sacrificed, hung over her. But Sophie wasn't done. She wasn't going to let them erase her again. In the morning, she would confront Colonel Harrison. She would confront the academy, and she would make sure they saw her for what she truly was, a qualified, capable pilot who wasn't going to be silenced or overlooked anymore. Tomorrow, things were going to change, and Sophie Blake was going to make sure of it. The next morning, the academy was on edge. Word had spread about Sophie's perfect navigation run, her scores wiped out without explanation, and the sabotage of her flight suit. Sophie could feel the atmosphere shift around her as she made her way through the hallways to Colonel Harrison's office. The whispers followed her like a cloud of smoke, still there, still persistent, but Sophie had learned to block them out. She wasn't here to fight the whispers. She was here to fight for respect. When she reached the door of Harrison's office, she knocked twice. The door opened with a soft creak. Colonel Harrison sat behind his desk, his gaze sharp and calculating as always. But this time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Irritation, maybe? He wasn't expecting her. "Cadet Blake," he said, his voice cold. "What's the problem now?" "I need to talk to you, sir," Sophie said, her voice steady. "About the simulator discrepancies. About the sabotage. About my performance." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're not going to get away with this, Cadet. The Academy has rules. You don't get to make them up as you go." "I never made up the rules," Sophie replied, standing tall. "I just followed the ones that matter, the ones that actually keep people alive. What's happening here isn't about the rules. It's about keeping me down, silencing me, because I don't fit the mold you want to keep." Harrison's expression darkened. "You think you're special, don't you?" Sophie met his gaze without flinching. "No, but I think I'm capable, and I deserve a fair chance to prove it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room felt thick, as if it could crack at any moment. Finally, Harrison broke the silence, his voice laced with contempt. "Then prove it, Cadet. Show me why I shouldn't throw you out of here. I've had enough of your insubordination." Sophie's heart pounded, but she kept her composure. This was the moment. She had prepared for this. She had the proof, the flight logs, the protocol, everything she needed to show that she belonged here. But it wasn't just about that. It was about proving to herself that she could overcome the impossible. "I will prove it," Sophie said firmly. "And when I do, I won't be the only one you'll have to answer to." With that, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving Colonel Harrison staring after her with frustration and something else, fear. It wasn't over. Not yet. Later that day, Sophie was summoned to the simulation bay for another round of training. As she entered the simulator bay, the familiar hum of the machines filled the air. She knew what was coming. Another test, another chance for them to make her fail. She had been marked. But this time, she wouldn't let them control the narrative. Her station was ready, but the simulator was the same one she had used before, her simulator. The one with the faulty rotor settings. She felt her stomach twist with frustration, but she quickly steeled herself. This time, she would not allow the system to make her the scapegoat. The exercise began, and Sophie immediately noticed the discrepancy in the calibration again. The rotor settings were off, just like before. This time, though, she didn't just go through the motions. She didn't just try to adjust and compensate. She took control. Sophie began adjusting the settings herself, inputting the correct parameters, overriding the system's artificial stability settings. She had the knowledge. She had the skills. And now, she had the nerve to challenge the system head-on. The other cadets watched from their stations, curious about what Sophie was doing. They had been instructed to complete the task within the set parameters, but Sophie was rewriting the rules, one adjustment at a time. She completed the exercise flawlessly, not just because she was faster or more accurate, but because she had done what no one else dared to. She had taken ownership of the situation and made it right. When the results flashed up on the main screen, the numbers were undeniable: 100% accuracy. Fastest completion time. 0 system errors. A murmur rippled through the room. Sophie's eyes scanned the display, then slowly lifted to meet the eyes of Colonel Harrison, who was standing at the back of the room, his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the tension in the air. This time, he couldn't dismiss her. "Impressive," Harrison said, though his voice lacked the usual certainty. "But don't think for a second that this changes anything." Sophie stood tall, her heart still racing, but her resolve unshakable. "It changes everything." As she turned to leave the simulator bay, she could hear the cadets whispering. The words were different now, softer, more curious. "Did you see that? She actually fixed the problem. She's the real deal." But Sophie didn't turn back. She had already made her mark. The fight wasn't over, but today, she had won a battle. Later that afternoon, as Sophie was walking through the academy's main hall, she noticed a group of senior cadets whispering behind her. One of them, Cadet Derek Wallace, approached her. He was one of the more privileged cadets, with connections to military families and a reputation for being one of the best. "You know," he said, his voice low but respectful, "that was impressive today. No one's ever done what you did with the simulator. I wasn't sure what to think of you before, but now I see it. You've got what it takes." Sophie met his gaze, surprised by the shift in his tone. "Thanks," she said, her voice steady but calm. "It's not about what I can do. It's about proving that everyone here can be more than what others think of them." He nodded, almost as if he understood what she meant. For a moment, they just stood there, two people who had learned something about respect in the unlikeliest of places. Then, Derek spoke again, this time with sincerity. "We're all here for a reason," he said. "Maybe it's time we start acting like it." As Sophie walked away, she couldn't help but feel a small sense of hope. The academy had not broken her. Not yet. She was ready for the next step. The days following Sophie's breakthrough were tense. The whispers in the hallways had shifted. Where before, she had been the subject of mockery and doubt. Now, the cadets spoke of her with a mix of respect and wariness. Sophie was no longer the underdog. She had proven herself. But the battle for respect was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Colonel Harrison remained cold and distant, his disdain for Sophie now hidden behind a veneer of professionalism. But Sophie knew better. She had become a thorn in his side, and he would find a way to push her out. The question was, how far would he go to break her? The next test came unexpectedly. It wasn't scheduled, but Sophie had been informed that a special exercise would take place. The stakes would be high. Cadets would perform under pressure, facing a series of emergency scenarios in real-time flight simulations. Sophie was prepared. She had been through worse. But as she entered the simulation room, she noticed that the setup was different this time. Instead of working solo, the cadets were split into teams. She was paired with Brandon Hoffman, the same cadet who had been so vocal in his disdain for her in the past. Sophie could already feel the tension in the air. The last thing she wanted was to be paired with someone who saw her as a threat. Hoffman, however, didn't seem to care much about the task at hand. He had the arrogance of someone who had always been the best, always had the connections. He hadn't had to fight for his place at the academy, and it showed in the way he carried himself. "We're doing this by the book, Blake," Hoffman said, as they strapped into their seats. "Don't think you can pull any tricks this time." Sophie glanced at him, her gaze steady. "I'm not here to play by anyone's rules but my own." The exercise began, and it quickly became clear that Hoffman was out of his depth. The first scenario was a rotor malfunction, something Sophie had dealt with 100 times before. The simulation began, and the helicopter rocked violently as the controls failed to respond properly. The simulated telemetry began flashing errors, something that should have triggered automatic system overrides. But nothing happened. Hoffman panicked. His hands fumbled over the controls, his breathing growing faster as he tried to recover the aircraft. Sophie's eyes narrowed as she glanced at the display. She could see the issue immediately. The system hadn't been calibrated correctly, just like the simulators before. "Sophie, what do we do?" Hoffman asked, his voice sharp with panic. Sophie's mind worked quickly. She had been trained to stay calm under pressure, to think through every possibility. She tapped the emergency override on the console and immediately adjusted the rotor response settings, compensating for the faulty calibration. Then, in a smooth motion, she directed Hoffman to adjust the pitch and yaw to counter the system error. "We're going to stabilize it," Sophie said firmly, her voice calm. "You follow my lead." For a moment, Hoffman hesitated, clearly unsure whether to trust her. But Sophie's confidence radiated through the cockpit, and reluctantly, he followed her instructions. Together, they brought the helicopter back under control. The simulation ended with a perfect landing, though Sophie's mind remained sharp, her thoughts focused. She didn't need the accolades. She didn't need validation. She knew what was real and what was manufactured. What she had done, what they had just done, was real. The danger was real. When the results were displayed, Sophie's eyes scanned the screen. 100% stability recovery. Fastest time. She had done it again. But this time, it wasn't just her name that appeared at the top. Brandon Hoffman was there too. His score marked with a noticeable improvement, though nowhere near as impressive as Sophie's. As the cadets filed out of the simulation bay, Sophie caught sight of Colonel Harrison watching from a distance. He seemed less concerned about the results than he was about the fact that Sophie had been the one to save the situation. For the first time, Sophie felt a flicker of victory. She had earned his grudging respect, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Later that day, she was summoned to Harrison's office again. Sophie's heart raced, but she was no longer intimidated. She knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. "Cadet Blake," Harrison began, his voice flat. "That was an impressive display earlier. You handled the situation well, even if it wasn't by the book." "I didn't come here to follow the book," Sophie said, standing tall. "I came here to rewrite it." The words hung in the air for a moment before Harrison's face tightened. "Don't get too comfortable, Blake. You're not the first to impress here, and you won't be the last." Sophie met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not here for accolades. I'm here to make sure what happened to me, what happened to us, never happens again. I'm here to make this place better." Harrison's lips curled into a tight smile, but Sophie could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She had exposed his weakness, and he knew it. The power was shifting, but Sophie knew it wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. The academy, with its entrenched biases and rigid systems, wasn't going to change overnight. But Sophie was no longer fighting for a seat at the table. She was here to tear down the walls and rebuild it from the inside. As she left Harrison's office, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much harder. But she also knew she was ready. The battle for her place had already been won, and now, the fight for everyone else's had begun. And Sophie Blake wasn't going to stop until the sky was open to anyone who earned the right to fly. The days at Pine Ridge Flight Academy passed with mounting tension. Sophie's actions during the last simulation had not gone unnoticed, and though the cadets' whispers continued to follow her, there was now a quiet respect that lingered in the air. Sophie had made an impression, but, as always, the road ahead was fraught with obstacles, and Sophie knew that her journey wasn't going to be easy. If anything, it would get harder from here. Colonel Harrison had made it clear that Sophie wasn't his first choice, and that his patience with her was running thin. But that only fueled Sophie's resolve. Despite the subtle sabotage and passive-aggressive comments from the other cadets, Sophie remained focused. Every day, she worked harder. Every night, she studied her manuals and ran through her custom flight simulations. She had no choice but to excel. She couldn't afford to give anyone an excuse to label her as anything other than the best. But things at the academy were becoming increasingly hostile. During briefings, she was often isolated, assigned to menial tasks that kept her away from the more important activities. She was treated as a second-class cadet, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. There was one moment, though, that Sophie couldn't shake. The day she was assigned to a team exercise with Cadet Brandon Hoffman again. This time, Sophie felt the weight of their unspoken tension, thick enough to suffocate her. It was a complex flight maneuver, something advanced that required perfect teamwork. The assignment was clear. The cadets were to work together to execute the mission, relying on each other's skills and training. But Sophie was immediately aware that Hoffman wasn't taking the task seriously. His arrogance had never been more evident. Sophie could sense that, as much as Hoffman had started to respect her abilities, there was still a part of him that resented her presence. The exercise began with Hoffman at the helm. Sophie was placed as co-pilot, expected to assist in keeping the helicopter stable while Hoffman navigated through the course. As soon as they were airborne, Sophie noticed something. Hoffman was hesitating. The first maneuver was a sharp turn that required precise timing and coordination. But Hoffman was fumbling with the controls, his movements sluggish. Sophie's heart rate quickened, sensing the problem before he even said a word. "Hoffman," she said calmly, "you need to take a sharper turn to keep us on course." He didn't respond. Sophie's eyes flicked to the telemetry screen. His lack of response to the controls was causing the helicopter's systems to overload. The airframe groaned under the strain. Sophie's hand moved instinctively to adjust the trim, countering the imbalance Hoffman had caused. "Hoffman, pull up," Sophie said, her voice more insistent now. The helicopter's speed was dangerously high, and they were about to lose control. He didn't react. It wasn't just an oversight, it was stubbornness. He wasn't listening. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a flight. This was about trust, and Hoffman wasn't willing to put his faith in her. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. "Hoffman, you're losing control. I'm taking over." Without waiting for his consent, Sophie took control of the helicopter. She bypassed the stabilization systems and manually adjusted the controls to steady the aircraft. Her movements were practiced and precise. She felt the helicopter's weight shift as the systems recalibrated under her command. The simulation ended with Sophie's flawless recovery, but Hoffman was visibly tense. His face was red with frustration, and he refused to meet her eyes. Sophie knew this was the moment things had to change. This wasn't just about her proving herself. It was about her showing everyone, Harrison, the cadets, that she was more than just a diversity hire or an outsider. She was a pilot, but she also knew the cost of this moment. The subtle pushback from Hoffman wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Later that evening, Colonel Harrison called Sophie into his office. She had expected this. She had prepared herself for whatever he might say. "Cadet Blake," Harrison began, his voice cold and distant. "You took control during the exercise today. I should remind you that such actions are against protocol. The idea of teamwork, cooperation, is central to this program. When you disregard that, you make a mockery of the system we've worked so hard to build." Sophie held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I didn't disregard the system, sir. I saved the mission. I kept us from crashing." His lips twisted into a thin smile. "You believe your actions were justified? Fine. But this attitude of yours, it's a problem, cadet. I won't tolerate insubordination, even if you manage to prove your worth during simulations." Sophie's chest tightened. It was clear he had no intention of acknowledging her expertise. He was only focused on the fact that she had done what no one else had the courage to do, take control when the situation demanded it. "Understood, sir," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the anger swirling inside her. "But I won't apologize for keeping everyone safe. You can call it insubordination, but I call it doing my job." Harrison stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Dismissed, cadet." Sophie left his office, feeling the weight of the conversation settle in her bones. She knew she had crossed a line with Harrison, and she wasn't sure where it would lead. But for the first time, she felt like she was finally being true to herself. As she walked down the corridor, her mind was a whirlwind. The academy had pushed her to the edge, and every step felt like a battle. But Sophie Blake wasn't going to let them break her. No matter how hard they tried, no matter how much they tried to keep her down, she was going to keep fighting. Because Sophie knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't just for her place in the sky. It was for every other person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And that was a fight worth winning. The days following Sophie's conversation with Colonel Harrison were heavy with anticipation. She could feel the tension in the air, not just from the instructors, but also from the cadets who now regarded her differently. Some had started to show her respect after the emergency landing incident, but there were still many who treated her as a threat to the established order. Sophie's every move felt scrutinized, her presence a challenge to the status quo. The academy was becoming a battleground, one where Sophie wasn't just fighting for her place, but for the future of everyone who had been overlooked, underappreciated, or dismissed. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. She sat by the window of her small apartment, watching the helicopters soar through the cold Colorado sky. The hum of the rotors echoed in her mind, blending with the whispers of doubt and judgment that lingered in the back of her thoughts. She had earned her place here. She knew that, but it wasn't enough. The academy was a system that didn't just need to be changed. It needed to be completely overhauled. The next morning, Captain Lisa Santos approached Sophie after class. Captain Santos had been one of the few instructors who seemed to see Sophie's potential from the beginning, even if it wasn't immediately apparent to the others. She had always given Sophie the benefit of the doubt, a small but important gesture that hadn't gone unnoticed. "Sophie," Captain Santos said, her voice low, "I need to speak with you." Sophie nodded, following Captain Santos into a quiet office off the main training floor. The room was small, with an old wooden desk cluttered with flight manuals and technical reports. The walls were adorned with photos of past graduates, young men in sharp uniforms, all smiles, all successful. Sophie couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness at the stark contrast between them and her own journey. "I've been watching you, Sophie," Captain Santos began, her expression serious. "And I think you're ready for something bigger. But there's something you need to know." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. "What's that?" Santos hesitated, glancing at the door as if making sure no one was listening. "There are people in this academy who want to see you fail. Colonel Harrison is one of them. He won't say it out loud, but he doesn't want you here. You're a threat to his position, to the system he's built, and that's why he'll stop at nothing to get rid of you." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She had known the fight wouldn't be easy, but hearing it from Captain Santos made it all the more real. The stakes had just become higher. "I won't let him stop me," Sophie said quietly, her voice steady with resolve. "I'm not backing down. Not now. Not ever." Santos studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I know. That's why I'm offering you something, an opportunity to make a real change here. I've been in this system long enough to know that things won't improve unless someone challenges the status quo. Someone like you." Sophie was taken aback. "What are you saying?" Santos reached for a folder on her desk and slid it across to Sophie. "This is your opportunity to make a difference. It's a proposal for a complete overhaul of the Academy's training protocols. It's about equality. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter their background, gets overlooked. I want you to help me lead this. You're the only one who can make it happen." Sophie's mind raced as she flipped through the documents. The proposal was ambitious, detailed. It called for a restructuring of the Academy's curriculum, incorporating diversity and inclusion into every aspect of training. It emphasized the importance of recognizing individual strengths and not just adhering to a rigid, outdated system that favored privilege over merit. But it also meant standing up to the very system that had been built to exclude her. "I can't do this alone," Sophie said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I'm just one cadet. What if they never listen? You're not alone, Captain Santos replied firmly. There are others who feel the same way. It's time for the Academy to recognize that excellence isn't defined by who you know or where you come from. It's about what you can do, and that's why we need you. Sophie looked down at the proposal, her mind spinning. She had come here to prove herself as a pilot, to be recognized for her abilities. But now, it seemed that her fight was about something much bigger, something that could change the Academy forever. Sophie took a deep breath and looked Captain Santos in the eyes. I'm in. The decision, though heavy, felt right. Sophie knew that she couldn't just be a bystander anymore. This was her chance to make a real impact, not just for herself, but for the future cadets who would come after her. The following days were filled with meetings and planning. Sophie worked closely with Captain Santos, drafting proposals and gathering support from the few instructors who were willing to listen. It wasn't easy. Colonel Harrison was already making his moves, doing everything he could to make Sophie's life harder. But Sophie wasn't backing down. She was ready to fight, not just for her place in the sky, but for a new era of aviation training, one that valued skill and merit over privilege and assumptions. Then, everything came to a head. The Academy had a big event coming up, the annual demonstration flight, where cadets showcased their skills in front of high-ranking officials. This year, it was different. There was more pressure, more scrutiny. The stakes were higher than ever. Sophie had been assigned to ground crew duty, monitoring radio communications and ensuring the equipment was running smoothly. She wasn't supposed to be part of the action. She wasn't supposed to be noticed. But Sophie knew that this was her moment. This was her chance to show everyone, Colonel Harrison, the cadets, and the officials, that she wasn't going anywhere. As the helicopters lifted off in perfect formation, Sophie stood in the control tower, watching the displays. She felt a sharp pang of frustration as she glanced at Brandon Hoffman, the same cadet who had been too arrogant to listen during their previous exercise. He was piloting the newest Apache, Delta 7. He had bragged all week about how this demonstration would secure his spot in the advanced program. But Sophie knew something he didn't. The telemetry showed a disturbing fluctuation in rotor efficiency. A problem. A dangerous one. Sophie watched, her eyes glued to the screen. She could see the rotor efficiency decreasing with every passing second. Hoffman was unaware, and no one in the control room had noticed yet. Sophie's hand hovered over the radio. She had a choice. She could keep silent, just like everyone expected her to, or she could speak up. She could save the demonstration, save lives, and risk everything. Without hesitation, Sophie keyed the radio. Delta 7, this is Blake. Recommend maintaining your altitude. Telemetry shows potential rotor instability. There was a sharp crackle in her earpiece. Colonel Harrison's voice cut through immediately. Blake, you are not authorized for flight communications. Maintain radio silence. Sophie's heart raced, but she didn't back down. She had come too far to turn back now. Sir, the rotor efficiency readings are unstable. Please listen. But Harrison's voice, full of authority, cut through the air. Blake, I said maintain silence. One more word and you're off tower duty permanently. Sophie didn't hesitate. She knew what she had to do. Delta 7, listen to my voice and follow my instructions carefully. She took control, and the moment everything was on the line, Sophie's decision would either make or break this mission. Sophie's pulse thundered in her ears as she held the radio transmitter in her hand. Her fingers tightened around it, her knuckles white. Colonel Harrison's orders still echoed in her mind, but it was too late. The moment had arrived, and Sophie wasn't about to back down. She repeated the command, her voice calm and clear despite the rising storm inside her. Delta 7, you need to cut power to your right side rotor input and reset your vector thrust. Do not use the main rudder. It will worsen the spin. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about. The radio was silent for a few seconds. Sophie's heart seemed to beat louder. In the quiet hum of the control tower, every second felt like an eternity. She glanced at the display again. Delta 7 was still spiraling, its altitude dropping faster than it should have. The rotor instability was growing worse by the second. Then, Hoffman's voice crackled through the radio, sounding strained and terrified. "This is crazy. I don't know what's happening. My controls are fighting me. It's not responding. Everything's shaking." Sophie swallowed hard. Her nerves stretched to the breaking point, but she didn't falter. This was her moment, not just for herself, but for every cadet who had ever been overlooked, for every underdog who had been told they didn't belong. She had the knowledge. She had the experience. Now, she had to trust herself. "Hoffman, listen to me. You have to trust me. Cut right side power to 40% and use left trim only. I'll guide you through this. I know this aircraft. I know this protocol. You have the control now. Just follow me." For what felt like an eternity, there was only static, and Sophie thought for a moment that he wouldn't listen, that her words would get lost in the wind. But then a crackling voice came through again, steadying, though still filled with panic. "All right, I'm doing it. I'm following you." Sophie exhaled, her breath steadying. "Good. Now, stabilize your pitch and hold position. Don't try to climb. Just hold steady. We're almost there. Keep it calm." Sophie's eyes locked on the simulation screen, watching the spiraling figure that was Delta 7. The helicopter's erratic movements began to slow, its rotor efficiency improving with each of Hoffman's adjustments. She spoke to him like she had done countless times in her homemade simulator. Calm, measured, precise. "Great job, Hoffman. Now hold that position. I'm going to talk you through the landing. Don't panic." Time seemed to stretch as she guided him, one step at a time, through the most delicate landing of his life. Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she continued to speak through the radio, every word crucial. The world outside the control tower had become a blur. Sophie was no longer just a cadet. She was the only one who could save him. As she guided him lower and lower, the tension in her body slowly began to ebb, replaced by a laser focus. Her senses were heightened. Her hands moved in sync with the instructions. After what felt like hours, Sophie finally spoke the words she had been hoping to say. "Hoffman, you're clear. I need you to descend now. You're almost at the emergency landing zone. Stay focused. Trust me." Sophie's eyes never left the screen. Slowly, Delta 7's descent became more controlled. The spiraling, erratic pattern was no longer visible. Instead, the helicopter stabilized, and its movement was precise, deliberate. Hoffman's breathing, once frantic, began to calm. Finally, after a tense few minutes, Sophie's voice came through the radio again. "Delta 7, you made it. Landed gently, right in front of the zone. Nice and easy." There was a final pause, and then Hoffman's voice, quieter now, but with genuine gratitude, came through. "I'm on it. Thanks, Blake. This is working. You saved me." Sophie watched as Delta 7 touched down, hard but controlled, bouncing once before settling safely on the emergency landing zone, 3 miles from base. A sigh of relief escaped Sophie's lips. The simulation was over, and Hoffman had landed. Sophie had done it. She had saved the mission. She had saved a life. As the rest of the cadets filed out of the simulator bay, murmurs of awe followed Sophie. She could hear them whispering, but this time, the words were different. "Did you see that? Blake saved him. She actually did it. She took control." Sophie didn't look back. She didn't need to hear their validation. It wasn't about proving something to them. It was about proving something to herself. She had done what they all had failed to do. She had risen above the limitations they had tried to impose on her. Colonel Harrison had been watching the entire time, and Sophie caught a glimpse of his face as the cadets exited the room. There was no smug satisfaction in his gaze, no condescending smile. For the first time, there was something else, something like doubt. Later that afternoon, Sophie was called to Harrison's office again. She knew what was coming. She had crossed the line. She had done what was required, but it had been against his orders, and he would find a way to make it her fault. But when Sophie entered the room, she found something unexpected. Harrison's expression wasn't one of anger or condemnation. It was one of reluctant acknowledgement. "You did what needed to be done, Blake," he said, his voice clipped but almost grudgingly respectful. "But that doesn't change the rules. The Academy can't function on individual heroics. You're not the only one with skills here. You're not above the system." Sophie stood tall, but there was no anger in her. Only calm resolve. I'm not above the system, Colonel, but I'm not below it either. I'm just here to make sure the system works for everyone. If it doesn't, it's a broken system. Harrison's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. Sophie knew that whatever happened next, it would be part of the fight. But for now, she had made her mark. As she left his office, Sophie felt something stir inside her. The battle was far from over. There was still more to be done. The academy, with all its traditions, needed to change. Sophie had already shown that she wasn't afraid to be the catalyst for that change, and she was ready for whatever came next. Because now, Sophie Blake knew that nothing could stop her from flying. Sophie's heart was racing as she left Colonel Harrison's office. She had expected a confrontation, but the reality of his begrudging respect still rattled her. It was clear that he would never admit it outright, but Sophie could see it in his eyes, the silent acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. But that didn't mean the fight was over. Not by a long shot. Later that day, Sophie's world tilted again when Captain Santos called her in for a private meeting. She had always been one of the few instructors who had recognized Sophie's potential, but now, things were changing faster than either of them could keep up with. "Sophie," Captain Santos said, her tone serious but encouraging. "We're at a crossroads. You've made your mark, but now you're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for everyone else who's been silenced, overlooked, or shoved aside by this system. And I'm not going to let you do it alone." Sophie's eyes narrowed, realizing that the conversation was turning in a direction she hadn't anticipated. "What do you mean?" Santos leaned forward. "I've spoken to a few senior instructors. The academy is about to come under review, official review. There are whispers that Colonel Harrison has been running things in a way that doesn't exactly align with the military's new directive for inclusivity and accountability. I've been gathering support behind the scenes. If you want to make the change we both know is needed, this is your chance." Sophie felt a wave of emotion flood over her. Exhaustion, excitement, and fear all mixed together. She hadn't realized how high the stakes had become. It wasn't just about her ability to fly anymore. It was about exposing a system that had failed so many before her. "What I need to do?" Sophie asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "You need to take the lead," Captain Santos said, her eyes intense. "The board's coming to the academy next week. They're going to evaluate the training standards, the discrimination claims, and the way things have been handled so far. Colonel Harrison will try to spin things his way, make it look like everything is running perfectly. But you have the power to show them the truth." Sophie nodded. She understood now. The system was broken, and she wasn't the only one who had suffered because of it. She could feel it in every word Captain Santos said. "I'll do it," Sophie said, her voice stronger than she had expected. "But I can't do it alone. I'll be with you every step of the way," Captain Santos assured her. "But it has to come from you. You've already proven you have what it takes to lead. Now it's time to take charge. Expose the truth." The plan was set into motion quickly. Sophie worked closely with Captain Santos to gather the documentation they would need to make their case. They compiled the evidence, the faulty training systems, the bias in cadet evaluations, and, most damning of all, the email chain between Colonel Harrison and the maintenance crew, showing a clear pattern of sabotage in Sophie's training. The day before the board's arrival, Sophie stood in front of the window in her apartment, watching the helicopters soaring above. She had spent countless hours looking at those very helicopters, dreaming of a day when she would be one of them, the ones who soared without fear, without limitations. And now, she was finally going to make that dream a reality. The next morning, Sophie arrived at the academy early. As she walked through the halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The pressure was almost unbearable, but she had no intention of backing down. She couldn't. Not now. The board arrived just after breakfast. It was a formal occasion, with high-ranking officials from the Department of Defense and senior members of the military, all gathered in the academy's main auditorium. Sophie could feel the weight of their eyes on her as she walked in, flanked by Captain Santos and a few sympathetic instructors who had agreed to speak on her behalf. Colonel Harrison stood at the front, his face composed, ready to defend the Academy's practices. He had no idea what was coming. The meeting began with the standard speeches, but it quickly became clear that Sophie wasn't going to let it slide. As the board asked questions about the cadets' performance, about the Academy's standards, Sophie took the floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sophie began, her voice clear and confident, "I've spent the last few months at this academy, fighting for my place. But what I've learned here has gone beyond my own experience. What's happening here is systematic. It's not just me. It's not just the cadets who are dismissed, disregarded, or undervalued because they don't fit the mold. The Academy's culture has created an environment where excellence is measured by who you know, not by what you can do." Sophie's words echoed through the room, and for the first time, Colonel Harrison's carefully crafted facade cracked. He stood at the back, his eyes flicking nervously between Sophie and the board members. "Colonel Harrison, would you care to comment on these allegations?" one of the board members asked, his tone suddenly much colder than it had been before. Harrison's face hardened. "There's no truth to this," he said, his voice strained. "Cadet Blake is simply—" "I'm not here to make excuses," Sophie interrupted, her gaze fixed on him. "I'm here to expose the truth." She stepped forward, handing the board a folder of evidence. It contained everything: the emails, the sabotage reports, the documented failures in the training systems. As the board flipped through the documents, the room grew quieter. Sophie had just laid bare the Academy's deepest secrets, and now there was no turning back. The board members exchanged glances, their faces growing more serious with each passing second. They had heard enough. Colonel Harrison stood there, his jaw clenched. He knew it was over. His reputation, built on years of manipulating the system, was crumbling in front of him. There was no way to spin the truth this time. One of the board members, a senior officer with a stern face, stood up. "We will begin a full investigation into these allegations. Colonel Harrison, I suggest you prepare for the consequences of your actions." Sophie could feel the air in the room shift, the weight of it settling into her chest. It wasn't over yet, but she had done it. She had exposed the system. She had made them listen. The Academy was no longer just a place where she fought for a seat. It was now the battleground where she had finally started to make change. But Sophie knew the fight wasn't over. The reforms wouldn't come overnight. The Academy wouldn't change in a single day. But this was the beginning. And Sophie Blake wasn't going to stop until the sky was open to anyone who earned the right to fly. The following days at Pine Ridge Flight Academy were charged with a new energy, one Sophie had never seen before. The board's review had shaken the institution to its core, and the changes that Sophie had fought for were already beginning to take shape. The cracks in the Academy's facade were wide open, and the truth was now exposed for everyone to see. But for Sophie, the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. She woke up to a quiet morning, the kind where everything seemed still, but beneath the surface, the wheels of change were turning. The news of the board's decision spread quickly. Colonel Harrison had been placed on leave, pending an investigation into his actions. Some of the senior cadets who had once ridiculed Sophie began to look at her differently. There was no longer an air of superiority in their gaze, but a reluctant respect that they couldn't quite suppress. It wasn't just the cadets who were affected. The instructors were also feeling the weight of the Academy's shift. Captain Santos was promoted to Director of Training, an official position that made her the most powerful voice in the Academy when it came to curriculum and policies. And with her promotion came a mandate to overhaul the Academy's outdated practices. Sophie had spent her entire life fighting to prove that she belonged, and now she had become a symbol of change, a living example of the very principle she had fought for. But it wasn't enough. There was still much work to do. Sophie found herself in the Academy's main office late one evening, looking over documents that Captain Santos had entrusted her with. She had become an integral part of the restructuring team, working alongside Santos and a few of the more progressive instructors who had supported her. They were reworking the training protocols to make them more inclusive, more reflective of the diverse backgrounds and experiences that cadets brought to the table. But even as she worked to change the system from within, Sophie knew that real change took time, and she couldn't afford to stop pushing. Every day, there were new challenges. The remaining holdouts, those who resisted the reforms, were still trying to undermine her. But Sophie didn't flinch. She was too focused now. "Are you sure about this?" Captain Santos asked one evening as she came into Sophie's office. Sophie looked up from the documents, the intensity of their discussion already behind her. Santos was holding a file in her hands, one that had been flagged for a final review. "I am," Sophie said. "This is our chance to make sure no one is ever held back again." Santos nodded, taking a seat across from Sophie. "It's going to be difficult. Some of these changes are going to ruffle feathers, even among the senior staff. But we've come too far to let anyone stand in our way now." Sophie smiled, though it was a smile tinged with the weight of all she had endured. "I've been fighting my entire life, Captain. If anything, I'm more prepared than ever." Together, they worked tirelessly, meeting with instructors, revising training materials, and crafting a curriculum that focused not just on the technical skills of flying, but on the holistic development of cadets as individuals. For the first time in the Academy's history, students would be assessed on their leadership, resilience, and ability to work with others, not just their flying abilities. The shift was revolutionary. By the time the first cohort of cadets graduated under the new training regimen, Sophie was no longer just a cadet herself. She had earned a position as an official training advisor, a role that would allow her to continue guiding the future of the Academy and to ensure that the changes she had fought for would be upheld. Sophie stood in the back of the graduation hall on that day, watching the new graduates, many of whom were from non-traditional backgrounds, receive their diplomas. She had fought for their chance to be here, and now they were the proof that change was possible. They weren't the same as the cadets from the previous years. They had been trained in a way that recognized their strengths, their backgrounds, their individual abilities. As Brandon Hoffman walked across the stage, his head held higher than it had been during their first simulation together, Sophie felt a quiet satisfaction. She had saved his life, but in doing so, she had also saved a part of herself. She had never let anyone define her worth. And now, she was part of something larger, something that would leave a legacy for generations to come. After the ceremony, Sophie found herself standing outside the Academy with Captain Santos. The air was crisp, the sky vast and open. For the first time in years, Sophie felt the weight of the journey lift from her shoulders. "You did it," Santos said with a smile. "You really changed the course of things here." Sophie nodded, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "We did it, and we're not done yet." The changes they had made at Pine Ridge Flight Academy had rippled far beyond the Academy gates. The reforms had caught the attention of military officials across the country, and Sophie's work had set a precedent for how future generations of pilots would be trained. No longer would potential be ignored. No longer would people be overlooked because of their background, their gender, or their social standing. In the months that followed, Sophie continued her work with the Academy, helping to guide the next generation of cadets. Those who, like her, would refuse to let anyone define what they could or couldn't achieve. But the real victory had come with the knowledge that her fight had created a new path, one where merit, not assumptions, determined who earned the right to fly. As Sophie stood at the front of the room, watching a new class of cadets taking their seats for their first day, she couldn't help but think back to the day she had arrived at the Academy. She had been just a name on a list, an unknown. But now, as the new cadets looked at her with admiration and respect, she knew that she had become something far greater than she had ever imagined. A trailblazer, a mentor, and a reminder that sometimes the sky only opens up to those who dare to break free. And as the helicopters roared to life overhead, Sophie Blake knew that she would always be a part of this sky, one that no longer kept people grounded, but lifted them higher than ever before.